I've been looking at the book of Leviticus for weeks, and I've gained some help, but I'll be honest and say I'm somewhat doubtful as to how well that will be translated to help for you. But we'll see what we are able to do. In the book of Leviticus, you may remember that we find the continuation of the book of Exodus, because the first 5 books of the Old Testament are considered by Jesus as the book of Moses. So it is one book consisting of 5 sub books, and they really continue in continuity. We're able to see that quite clearly when we read the very end of the book of Exodus, and we begin with the book of Numbers. So in Exodus chapter 40, the last paragraph reads, "Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of Yahweh filled the tabernacle." We then turn over to Leviticus and we read, "Then Yahweh called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting," that is the tabernacle. And so there is continuity that connects the narrative, the story, the progression from Exodus to Leviticus. We also have talked about that there are 5 books in the book of Moses, or the Torah, and Leviticus is the center. And that creates a fulcrum or a hinge, which is one of the ways the Hebrews wanted to teach and emphasize this is the point, or at least a way in which they could accent a point. Tim very well took you through, in one sense, like on a human scale, what would it be like as you would consider offering a sacrifice in the Day of Atonement as, in one sense, one citizen within the nation of Israel because of what was provided for you in the Levitical system. But the theology of Leviticus is really the theology of the Torah. It's being developed throughout the first 5 books. And what we find here is that the goal of God's relationship with man is achieved through the means of what is provided in the covenant. And here we see that that is the tabernacle, the Levitical priesthood, and the Levitical sacrificial system. Now, that in one sense could sound like, in Peanuts, like wah, 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 wah. All right, but what that summary, if you get that, then I think we have made major success for your ability to understand the book of Leviticus. Right? So I'll draw it up on the board in a way that we will see this spatially worked through for thinking about what occurs in the book of Leviticus. And you'll see that there are parallels here. So do you remember in the Garden of Eden, what was the structure of Eden? It was a hill. And on this hill, we have something that seems to be described as that there was a garden. And on the garden, which was on the hill, there was a certain, in one sense, a center place. And God dwelled. He was present there with man. And in that sense, what flowed out from the garden was, in that sense, it was flowing out of his relationship with Adam, as it would be extended unto all the world as Adam, and then with Eve as they were fruitful and they multiplied and they filled the earth. And so in that sense, you can see the blessings of the relationship, which are namely God's presence with Adam. They moved outward in execution of the mission. So what was, in one sense, the end or the goal? It was fellowship or communion with God through his presence. How was it mediated, or what was the means for that to be achieved? Adam and Eve being fruitful and multiplying and and filling and ruling and having dominion over all the earth. That would be how it is achieved. When we come to Leviticus, what we see is one, we obviously see that all orders, I'm going to have to change like a little bit of we'll have to have two views, a plan view and an elevation view. All right. But we're also going to see that it is an elevated place in the camp, but there is going to be the tent of meeting. And in the tent of meeting, there are two places. So we'll go to like a plan view. All right. So here we would have the Holy of Holies. This whole thing would be considered the tabernacle. And out and around, we'll get into it in Numbers of the exact arrangement, but around Israel, we would see that first there will be the priests, and they will be, in one sense, closest to God's presence. But then outside of the priests, we will have the nation Israel. This is really not working out much. And then further out, we would see, what would the nations have? They would have a graded access to the presence of God. So in that sense, you can see it also, it works like this. The presence of God is mediated by degree through the covenant relationship, through the provisions of the Mosaic covenants in the Levitical priesthood and sacrifices because of God's presence in the tabernacle. All of that is giving details, contours, particular ways that we are able to see that the covenant relationship is all about achieving fellowship with God. When you think of fellowship with God, communion with God, you have to have the presence of God. God establishes this with Israel in the Mosaic covenant through his presence in the tabernacle because of the means of, we'll just abbreviate, the tabernacle, the priesthood, and the sacrificial system. Now, this is going to be helpful when we won't get into all of the details, and there's certain details I don't understand. I'll give you some general ways in which I think can principalize certain understandings. But the details in that sense are expressions of the consequences of God's presence among his covenant people. Or we could say it this way, and this will be developed. You can have 1 through 16 could be the indicative of God's presence and provision of the tabernacle, the priesthood, and the sacrifices. And then you would have verses 17 through 27 in Leviticus. It is the imperative upon Israel because of God's presence and provision of the priesthood and the sacrifices in the tabernacle. So that's a summary of the book of Leviticus. But to give you another, in one sense, mirror way that this is how the gospel works too, you probably are familiar with Romans chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. And you may remember that the opening clause is, Paul, I urge you, brothers, on behalf of the mercies of God. So that would be the indicative of what God has provided for Jew and Gentile in the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's the mercies of God. I urge you, on account of the mercies of God, that you present yourselves as living sacrifices. In that sense, that your whole life is being presented to him. That's the indicative. So in this way, Leviticus is providing for us the same framework as the gospel provides for Jews and Gentiles through faith in Jesus. That is, what God provides to enable his presence to be among his people so that they may have fellowship and communion with God. He provides it here in what is shown in the tabernacle, the priesthood, and Levitical system. So God in Jesus Christ provides what is necessary for you to have fellowship with God through his presence. Both have the indicative, you now must live your life in light of that defining presence of God. Does that make sense? The indicative, the first 16 chapters of Leviticus, the tabernacle, the priesthood, the Levitical system, it comes to its highest moment in the Day of Atonement. And then chapter 17 through 27, the indicative. You now must live your life as holy to the Lord. Right? That's the most simple way that I would structure the book of Leviticus. But that doesn't take you through the drama of what happens in Leviticus and how it is that we are going to learn very important truths for us from the book of Leviticus. So at least I want to try to start with clarity, and then I might confuse you from here out. All right. But so far, are you understanding what is taught in Leviticus? This general big picture. All right. First, we went through the first 9 chapters of Leviticus, and that's where we were given detailed instruction for the provision of the priesthood and the sacrificial system. Lots of details that were involved in it that had to deal with not only something being dictated by God as for his purpose, it didn't have to be consecrated. Then we come, and this is where we were in chapter 10. Now, what is very significant is we were able to see that what God provided in Leviticus for the tabernacle brought about the consummation of, in one sense, the resolution that was not solved at the end of Exodus. Because though the tabernacle had been constructed, though God had come and dwelt within the tabernacle, Moses was not able to enter the tabernacle in Exodus, which means the goal of the covenant relationship had not been consummated. In Leviticus, we are able to see in the first 9 chapters that what God provides in the priesthood and the sacrificial system, it actually achieves this end of the covenant relationship. Moses and Aaron enter in to the tabernacle, and thus that is, in one sense, it's a crescendo moment that in the entering of the tabernacle through the priesthood, the sacrifices, and all that's involved in that system, they now, Israel, through the representatives of Moses and Aaron, they now enter into the very presence of God. This is the consummation of the goal of this covenant relationship. Now, at this point, you pause and you see parallels. If you are a believer in Jesus Christ, the offer in the gospel is this offer: enter into God's presence. Be given the blessing of the life of God. That is the goal of covenant relationship with God through Jesus Christ. Now, I think if preachers would make this clear, if parents would make this clear, we might have some things that we don't, in the short term, appreciate. Because unless God is what you want, then the gospel is not what you will believe. If people are wanting something in the place of God, but they think God is the means for them to get that thing, then maybe they'll be interested in that kind of a gospel. That's not the gospel. God has never created, in one sense, so that his image bearers could be satisfied in something other than him. But God created so that his image bearers would indeed come to be satisfied in having him. And so that was what Adam had in the garden, which was lost through sin. But even here, we are able to see through God engaging on the basis of grace and establishing covenant relationships. We saw it with Noah, Abraham, and now it is being developed with Israel through Moses. There is a, not fully, but there is a progressive recovery of what was lost. I extend that to you, that God offers in Jesus Christ this goal, that you enter into God's presence, that you are granted life with God forever. Do you want that? Believe the gospel of Jesus Christ. If you want to make God a means to some other end, then you go to another religion. You do not come to Jesus Christ. Well, with that, we're able to see this is achieved for Moses and Aaron, and in that sense, in the representative system that has been established for Israel with Yahweh through Moses, the mediator, and Aaron, the priest, it consummates. And they, in verse 23, Moses and Aaron went into the tent of meeting. And they came out and blessed the people, and the glory of Yahweh appeared to all the people. Then fire came out before Yahweh and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of fat on the altar. And all the people saw it and shouted and fell on their faces. At this point, you think the provision of the Mosaic covenant and the tabernacle, the priesthood, and the sacrificial system, it works. I'm sorry to be so crass, but in one sense, the relationship indeed is achieving the end. But you might know what comes next in the first 3 verses of chapter 10. This is going to be the kind of like the event that shapes how we're going to get some development in the order of Leviticus. So the presence of God is in the tabernacle. He is dwelling among Israel. Moses and Aaron, as their representatives, are able to enter because of the priests and the sacrifices. But there are some real challenges to life with God. And here we see them in lethal ways in the first 3 verses. Then Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, took their respective fire pans and put fire in them, and they placed incense on it and offered strange fire before Yahweh, which he had not commanded them. And fire came out from the presence of Yahweh and consumed them, and they died before Yahweh. Then Moses said to Aaron, "It is what Yahweh spoke, saying, by those who come near me, I will be treated as holy, and before all the people I will be glorified." So Aaron kept silent. Now, one of the things that are really helpful about for modern Christians, for us to read the Old Testament, including Leviticus 10, 1 through 3, is this is our God. He literally is a consuming fire. And C.S. Lewis is helping us with the little phrase in Chronicles of Narnia that they forget which child asks about Aslan, but is he safe? And the beaver answers no, but he's good. In one sense, when we consider, and it is necessary that we say it this way, when we consider gathering as God's people to worship him, we are worshiping this God, who, just like in verse 24 of chapter 9, when his fire came out before Yahweh and consumed the burnt offering and the portions of the fat on the altar, That was God's favorable presence consuming the sacrifice as acceptable through divine fire. So here, divine fire now consumes Nadab and Abihu. And the reason we are told is the last clause in verse 10. I'm sorry, in verse 1 of chapter 10, at least the last clause in the Legacy Standard Version. And that is they offered strange fire before Yahweh, which he, that is Yahweh, had not commanded them. We'll get into some what it may be, what it might not be, but what we are able to say definitively, what did Nadab and Abihu do that caused Yahweh to consume them in divine fire of judgment? And what was disobedience?
The fire from somewhere else instead of the altar.
Well, what we know definitively is that they did that which he had not commanded them. Now, the first 9 chapters include, and then we will see chapters 11 through 14, they will also reiterate distinctions between that which is clean and unclean, and then we will see holy and profane, and those will be the main categories that the book of Leviticus will teach. There must be in Israel and among the priesthood the ability to distinguish between that which is holy and that which is profane, between that which is clean and that which is unclean. Commandments were given for what it is they were to do in chapters 1 through 9. So at some point, all we are able to definitively say is they did something that God did not command them to do. It is from this that you have people like John Calvin and the Reformed tradition in particular. They develop what is called the regulative principle. And that is that God regulates acceptable worship. Man does not create or generate or, dictate, I would like to give God this. Rather, God dictates, you will give me this. It will be in obedience to my commandments. And so, thus, it's regulation of worship. Nadab and Abihu offered something or did something in some way that was not according to the commandment of God. They did not give to God the sacrifice as God commanded it to be given. And that was unholy. And so they were consumed by divine fire for judgment. Now, this in one sense is dramatic, but this has now huge consequences. What do we now have in the tabernacle? Well, no, after verses 1 through 3. We have dead bodies. Okay. Chapter 9, verse 23. How did Moses and Aaron, how were they able to enter into the tent of meeting? All right, but it was through everything that was involved in the tabernacle sacrificial system and the priests. Now you have a defiled tabernacle. What, in one sense, does that jeopardize? It seems to potentially jeopardize how can Israel and Yahweh continue fellowship and communion when now the very tabernacle has been defiled with dead bodies because of their sin. What then follows is the explanation, and it comes again out of the character of God acting graciously and yet in concert with his holiness, that he provides a means for the defilement of even the tabernacle to be cleansed. And and it's understandable in one sense when we're not tracing the connections at maybe larger macro aspects of Leviticus and Exodus, we may get into the details and not see what the details are actually achieving. What the details in Leviticus are going to explain for us is God, out of his grace and being merciful, is going to enable the tabernacle to be cleansed and thus to be restored so that worship can continue according to God's demands and fellowship and communion with God through his presence is restored through Israel. Now, 11 through 15 go through this. So, chapter 10 is this definitive event that enables the detail of clean and unclean to be stipulated in chapters 11, 12, 13, and 14. But it also provides the ongoing instruction for priests and people to be able to distinguish between clean and unclean. And so there's a number of details that are given there. But what we need to see is it's lethally relevant in light of the execution of Nadab and Abihu for their sin. It also is theologically critical because it has to enable God's presence to continue to dwell in the tabernacle so Israel can continue to have the fellowship that the covenant promised. So the details of the clean and the unclean have that incredible significance. We'll briefly talk about what the sins may have been. I gave to you the clause at the end of verse 1, which says we definitively are able to say they did something that God did not command. Because of what follows in chapter 9, that Moses is giving instructions to Aaron and to his sons about what they now must do, and that includes in verses 9 through 11 instruction about not drinking wine or strong drink. Some people think this might be a tip of the hat, that Nadab and Abihu might have been inebriated in the tabernacle and in the execution of their priestly duties. Others do not think that is all that is going on, and so they give other observations of what might be going on that enabled them to understand what the sin was. And they take from various aspects of the rest of chapter 10 of being able to determine, like, no, it could have been that they neglected the way in which the sacrifice was to be, the burnt offering was to be given. I don't know. And I find it somewhat difficult for anyone to say definitively what it is. But what they did do is they did something that God commands them not to do. And so that's what made the fire or the offering to be strange. It was unauthorized by God's commandments. And that's what makes the fire strange. We therefore learn that worship that God accepts in the tabernacle through the priesthood has to be in obedience to his commandments. That is the only way that the fire, the offering, would be acceptable. So that's about as far as I can go with the nature of the sins or the sin of Nadab and Abihu. But the consequences now require the priests and the people to understand the importance of distinguishing clean and unclean. And so there's a number of ways that these chapters are divided. I find helpful the most simple ways to explain things. And so, one way that I've seen in big sweeping terms, there is sort of a two categories for dealing with clean and unclean. We have clean and unclean animals in chapter 11, and that would relate to eating these animals. And so, if you eat an unclean animal, where does that unclean animal now go? Into your body, right? Then the next section is going to deal with that there can be fluids that emerge from the body, namely blood through birth, and it seems that in that sense it's what comes out of the body that then would make one unclean. Then there is a turn to other kinds of external things on the body, different kinds of diseases and such as leprosy that he gives attention to. And that would indicate that something on the outside of the body makes someone unclean. And then he returns again to fluids from within the body that enables one to be unclean. Right? So that's a big scheme for how can you at least have some principles for understanding the different stipulations for what would make one unclean as they understood themselves in relationship to God because of his presence being in the tabernacle. Now, this enables you to know something. Was it possible for Israel, through their own volitional choices, to ensure permanently that they would never be unclean? If you could be polluted such that you are not able to be sanctified and thus to approach God in worship even as you came towards the priests, right? Because of fluid coming out of you or a disease that was on top of you. Could you ensure by your volitional actions, by your choices, that you would never be unclean? You do not have that power. As a matter of fact, every female within Israel would be unclean. So we're able to see that God's demands for that which will be pure, that which will be clean, enabled. Yes, there could be moral disqualifications, but there also are ritual disqualifications. Human ability did not possess the power to ensure Israel was going to be unclean. I'm sorry, that Israel that would be clean. It was inevitable that you would be unclean. Now, this in one sense also helps us because sometimes we can read the Old Testament, especially Leviticus, and you have all these prescriptions about this is going to make you unclean and this is what you need to distinguish as clean. And we think that it's this rules. But when you look at what could make you unclean and you just make the observation that you did not have the power to ensure that you would never be unclean, what are you now dependent upon in God such that you would know I may be able to return and to worship God, which would be on the basis of grace, right? It would be in fulfillment of the covenant promise which God made on the basis of his character of grace that you would not always remain unable to offer him worship. And so, in that sense, even when we're getting into things that are somewhat, I find it's somewhat hard to explain why is this considered to be unclean and this is considered to be clean. I don't have answers for all of those. We are able to see they still enable us to say not only is it through moral volitional choices, but it's also through things that will happen to those within Israel that God makes a provision according to the covenant promises that he will be gracious and enable there to be a way in which you can be restored and worship him. And so the cleansing laws or the cleansing legislation of chapters 11 through 15 are given through Moses for priest and people. We then come to chapter 16, which we already looked at and gave a diagram for, and this is operating as the center of all of the Torah. So in one sense, we drew diagrams that show this is what a chiastic arrangement of the Torah is, and at the center of that chiastic centerpiece is Leviticus 16. And Leviticus 16 is itself arranged in a chiastic structure, and the very hinge or fulcrum of Leviticus 16 is verses 15 through 19, where the atoning sacrifice was offered. Now, we also have to go back to, and what's going on as it pertains to the tabernacle? We still have to deal with the defilement. So the cleansing is not only of the people of Israel, the cleansing also has to, at this initial event, it has to address the defilement of the tabernacle because of the dead bodies of Nadab and Abihu. So Leviticus 16 is also a reestablishment of what Nadab and Abihu's sin and defilement did to the tabernacle, such that that which was achieved at the end of Leviticus 9 can be restored. And thus the representatives of the nation of Israel can enter in again, and that would be the high priest, and thus fellowship with God by entrance into his presence is achieved through the covenant promises of God made with Israel through Moses at Sinai. Now, all of this enables us to be able to see that God is a gracious God. And God engages his people and makes covenant promises that he fulfills so that his people will be given the blessing of communion and fellowship with him. And he overcomes that which would prevent his dwelling to be in the midst of his people, which is in fulfillment of the promise. And even their sin is provided a solution, and the solution is atonement. The solution is atonement. And so chapter 16 is dealing with the tabernacle as it had to be cleansed. It is reestablishing what the tabernacle and the worship through the priesthoods and the sacrificial system acquired, and it therefore became continually in Israel the means by which their sin would be dealt with and God's presence could remain amidst his covenant people. It is through atonement. So this was the perpetual state. Chapter 17 then turns, and this is the hinge. Chapter 17 now begins advancing the imperatives that flow from the indicative of God providing a means of atonement to deal with the sins of his people, and that he may be in their presence and they may have fellowship and communion with him. A few of the comments that I think are helpful for us to just theologically make from thinking about Leviticus. I want you to turn to Malachi for this. If you consider what is given in the priests, the sacrificial system, and the atoning sacrifice, the details that we haven't gone into, but the details that you know that the priests had to go through obedience to God's commandments, into what he washed, what he wore, how he approached, how he gave it, where he gave it. When the people had to offer to the priests that which would be clean, and thus they could then sanctify and worship to God, How many people are giving volitional, deliberate, discerning choices to what was offered and how it was offered? Were the people to know that they had to give what God demanded of them? Did they have this knowledge? They did. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 dictated this is clean, this is unclean. This is how you are unclean. This is what was required for you to become clean. The people were given this information. We're reading the book of Moses. The priests were given this information. When we get to 17 through 27, we will see that then they're given the ability by way of Moses' instruction to distinguish between the profane and the sacred. They therefore are able to know God accepts this as a potential, could be instrument, could be an object to be sanctified for his purposes, and God would reject this. The people and the priests know this. So when we consider what actually occurs in Israel when they offer to God sacrifices that do not meet his requirement, how culpable are people and priests in that action? Are they sort of like, wow, I can't believe I made a mistake? No, to offer up, and what we'll read, to offer up sacrifices to God meant that the people brought to the priests something that they would have known was not acceptable to God, either because it was not clean and therefore it wasn't even eligible to be sanctified for the use of worship of Yahweh in the tabernacle. And the priest also complied with violations of God's commandments, and they took it and used it either because it was not clean or because they did not sanctify. Are you able to see the levels of volitional disobedience against the commandments of God? We sometimes will read Levitical legislation and think like, what kind of God is this? It has all of these details and these requirements that requires his people to offer up these detailed sacrifices such that this animal is not clean and yet this one is clean, and this offering would not be acceptable and this one would be acceptable. We tend to critique God and his legislation because it doesn't make sense to us, and we do not even consider Israel would know how to offer worship to God that would please him, that would honor him. And so when we read later, and we'll go to Malachi, and we read such as this in chapter 1, verse 7, you are presenting defiled food upon my altar. But you say, how have we defiled you, in that you say the table of Yahweh is to be despised? This is kind of like when you say something to your child, you give them a very clear command. And it's not only clear, it is sufficient, so that the only thing that they should do is exactly what they were commanded to do. And then they do not do it. And then you call them to account for their failure to do what you have commanded to do. And then they respond with, why is it that you don't that you demand this of me and you don't accept what I did? Like, I mean, where it's like, you're insane. The violations of Israel in covenant worship to God, because they offered up to him sacrifices which indeed defiled the altar, is because of the volitional choices that Israel made to disobey God's commandments. In the same way, when we consider our own sins before God, what are our own sins always? We have violated the clear commandments of God. We have not done what God commands of us. In that way, we are able to see that God is holy, and the worship which God will accept is to be pleasing to him. It is to conform to his commandments. That clearly was the case in Israel, and Leviticus gives us details for what was required. And when there is violation of it, it is because there is deliberate disobedience to the commandments of God. Just as when we sin against God, it is because we deliberately disobeyed his commandments. Now, if God were not gracious and did not provide atonement for sin, then in one sense, just like with the tabernacle and the defilement through Nadab and Abihu's sins, all would be lost. But because God is gracious and God has chosen for atonement to be made, there is hope with God that his people will not have fellowship with God as something not possible, and the presence of God will not be removed from them. But that is only because of atonement for sin. Now, I found Michael Morales's, he deals with this question, and to be honest, I haven't even asked this question, but it makes perfect sense, and I should have asked this question. We have not yet seen in the Torah explicitly where God is saying, through atonement, through an animal sacrifice, will I forgive your sin. Now, we have seen animal sacrifices repeatedly being offered when there is a divine presence of God and his chosen one or ones are meeting with him, that there in worship a sacrifice occurs. So when Noah got off of the ark, what does he do? He offers sacrifices. And interestingly, Moses tells us that he offered clean animals in that sacrifice, and that too was on a mountain. When Abraham has his son spared by God, and God provides a ram, a sacrifice is made there on that mountain. So we have seen sacrifices such that even one is seemingly a substitutionary sacrifice, but never is it explicitly noted that the sacrifice is an atonement for sin. Also, we haven't seen, in one sense, presented to us, how does an animal come to actually stand in as a life for the sins of God's image bearers? Because in the very beginning, we're able to see that Adam is not like the animals. And woman is made from him. She is bone of his bones and flesh of his flesh. How is it that animals are able to be sacrifices and stand in and count for Adam and Eve, who are wholly different? Michael Morales says that this is, in one sense, it's a picture, a type that is developed with the animal sacrifices, but it's unresolved yet. We don't have the resolution of how. How do the animal sacrifices stand in? And here we're able to see that there was this building expectation that has gone unanswered, that now in Leviticus 16, we are able to see, we now see how it stands in. That Yahweh does look at the atoning sacrifices on the Day of Atonement to count for the sins of his people. And in that sense, it's not because they are equal to the image bearer, but rather because God has chosen for them to be the representatives that stand in for them. But not any will do. Like all things, and Leviticus makes this clear, like all things, it has to be a fitting or an acceptable sacrifice. There's another I don't know, maybe the chart's not going to do as much good for you, but what could be used in worship could only be that which is clean. So we won't have time, but in 17 through 27, it will make distinctions between the profane and the holy, like distinctions were made between the clean and the unclean in 11 through 15. If you think in terms of what Leviticus teaches, that when you were to imagine what might be used in worship for Yahweh through the priesthood in the tabernacle, you only could choose from that which was clean. Unclean things could never be used in worship of Yahweh. But in selecting those things which were clean, you actually had to then sanctify or consecrate those clean things. And when that occurred, this clean, now sanctified object to be used in worship for Yahweh in the tabernacle becomes holy. And this is what holy things are. They are forever separated to be Yahweh's possession. So if you used, in that sense, something clean that was then sanctified to be used for worship of Yahweh, it never could be used for anything else. That's what holiness meant. That's what holiness means. So when we are able to see, like Peter, go and call the church, that they are now a holy people of God, it is saying, and we'll see how there's a mirror here, and I'll try to draw a quick picture, that what Israel is as a nation in the covenant arrangement, you will remember, they are a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. So that collectively, through the priesthood and through the sacrificial system, they, among all the people, they are the holy people. They are the ones who have been made clean and have been sanctified by Yahweh to be forever his. What they offer in worship is now only from the clean and that which will be set apart for Yahweh forever. And so the Levites will be the tribe that they will not be given land, as we will see, but their inheritance will be Yahweh. They are forever set apart to be the priests who will serve him. They are holy. Everything else used in the worship of Yahweh is also the same. It is to be holy. So one Old Testament scholar explains it this way: everything that is not holy is common. Common things are divided into two groups, clean and unclean. Clean things become holy when they are sanctified, but unclean objects cannot be sanctified. Clean things can be made unclean if they are polluted. Holy items may be defiled and become common, even polluted, therefore unclean. Sacrificial blood is necessary to cleanse and to sanctify. Sacrifice can undo the effects of sin and human infirmity. Sin and disease lead to profanation of the holy and pollution of the clean. Sacrifice can reverse this process. Does that make sense? Right? Leviticus pushes this into the details of Israel's worship of Yahweh according to the Levitical priesthood and the sacrificial system. However, something larger is also being presented to us here. If we go back here to the very bad picture, but this one in particular, if you remember, these were the nations. And this was Israel. And these were the priesthood. And we were saying that this works outwardly. What does atonement now also teach us in the same way that we learn through the Levitical system? That you can have something that has to be clean, that then is to be sanctified, and then becomes holy in worship to Yahweh. That atonement can now move outward such that through God's mercy and atonement for sin, it's possible that even the nations can come through the holy Son of God who is Israel because of a priestly ministry that atones for sin in God's presence, that there can be a reversal of what was lost. This is what Hebrews goes on to explain God did through Jesus Christ. Now, it does enable us to say in ways that Leviticus chapter 17 through 27 stipulates about the profane and and the holy. So there is for us categories to be able to understand about the cosmos, that in this sort of worship universe of the tabernacle in Israel, in the context of the nations, we are able to say that indeed that which is clean can be used in the camp to be sanctified and then used in the worship of Yahweh. So too, we are able to say that the priests, as the holy ones, and the clean people, which are Israel, God can now, through this atoning work, potentially provide something that in the future might change the Gentiles. But the cosmos, as we understand it in Leviticus, you have Gentiles who were unclean, Israel who is clean, and the priests who are holy. That is the ordering of the universe at the time of this covenant. But in Jesus Christ, we will see God changes that because of what is provided in atonement. God can only be approached by clean men who enjoy the fullness of life themselves. The unclean are those who in some way have an aura of death about them, and they manifest less than physical wholeness. All right, this is true spiritually of every sinner, but it is true in ceremonial or ritual uncleanness in Israel. And so the book of Leviticus stipulates that some things which are not only the cause of from moral decisions, but also the cause of things that you cannot control, some things that are natural to this present life, it will make you ritually unclean before God. And this goes on through great detail in the book of Leviticus. I like summary explanations that create a thread that runs through things, right? I can't explain why everything is declared unclean in the book of Leviticus. I know people have many different theories for why they're able to say this is what makes it unclean. However, I do find it's somewhat helpful when you consider what some Old Testament scholars make the unifying theme through that which is declared unclean. It is because it has an aura of death. An aura of death. That is, that whether it's the food, whether it's the particular disease, whether it is this animal or that fish or this insect, there was something about that distinction that made these groups to be unclean. There was something, whether it's an association with their use in pagan worship, or whether it was something about them that seemed to stipulate them as marked by death in a particular way, that the book of Leviticus makes distinctions. But the reason for the distinction is related to the person of Yahweh, the character of God. God can only be approached by that which is pure. anything that has an aspect of death, an aspect of impurity, cannot be used in the worship of God. And so the laws or legislation from chapter 17 through 27 continues to give Israel an ability to make this distinction between that which is common and that which is sacred, that which is clean and that which is unclean. And so chapter 17 through 27 deals with this life, which is to be holy unto the Lord in worship. But one of the things that is maybe a place to kind of boil it down, this still is a blessing of fellowship with God. And chapter 24 may give us one place to see an especially important key to this life that is lived before God. In that sense, a way in which we understand that because of the indicatives of Leviticus 1 through 16, we can understand the imperatives that follow life with God in chapter 17 through 21 to really rest on doing what God enables us to do from blessings of fellowship with God. Right? In chapter 24, the first 9 verses present to us something that symbolically illustrates the fellowship benefits of this covenant relationship with God. I'll read them. Then Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, command the sons of Israel that they bring to you clear oil from beaten olives for the light, to make a lamp burn continually. Outside the veil of the testimony in the tent of meeting, Aaron shall keep it in order from evening to morning before Yahweh continually. It shall be a perpetual statute through your generations. He shall keep the lamps in order on the pure gold lampstand before Yahweh continually. Then you shall take fine flour and bake 12 cakes with it. 2/10 of an ephah shall be in each cake, and you shall set them in 2 rows, 6 to a row, on the pure gold table before Yahweh. And you shall put pure frankincense on each row, that it may be a memorial portion for the bread, even an offering by fire to Yahweh. Every Sabbath day he shall set it in order before Yahweh continually. It is an everlasting covenant for the sons of Israel. And it shall be for Aaron and his sons, and they shall eat it in a holy place, for it is most holy to him. From the offerings to Yahweh by fire, his portion forever. All right, the details relate to 2 things that are in this area of the tabernacle, which is just before the Holy of Holies. It is the lampstand and the bread of presence. Right, the lampstand and the bread of presence. And here we're able to see, you might remember, we could go back to Exodus, but we don't have time. And we could see that the lampstand had 7 separate lights and the way that it was built. And do you remember the shape of the lampstand? Like a tree, seemingly there, the tree of life. So the lampstand shaped as it was commanded to be in the image of a tree has 7 lights on it. And in front of the lampstand on the table, there is the bread of presence. Every day, the light is to be serviced by Aaron and his sons. And every Sabbath, the bread is to be replaced, the bread of presence. Symbolically, what that seems to indicate is that there is continually, which is to say eternally, given for Israel through the representation system of the priesthood in the tabernacle, there is the light of divine presence that shines down on the bread. Such as, what does Israel enjoy? We could say 24 hours 7 days a week, 365. What do they enjoy through the priesthood provided for them in this outer, it would have been right here. What do they enjoy? The light of God's presence shining on the bread, right? That indicates, in one sense, maybe a symbol of what was lost in the garden. The presence of God, where he gave life forever to his people, Adam and Eve. Such that this is indicating what God has done in the provision of the tabernacle, where God is present, the priest and the sacrificial system. God is providing for Israel a rest where they are able to enter into his presence and enjoy forever this life that comes from him, lit by the light that comes from his very being. In that sense, it seems that there is a clear portrait of what does God provide for his redeemed people in fulfillment of his covenant promises through the priest and the sacrifice and the temple. A recovery of Eden. That this is, in one sense, an architectural Eden, where God is going to provide forever what is necessary for Israel to live a life that would be pleasing to God. Now, all of this, in one sense, continues as we come to the New Testament, and it is, again, symbolically represented for us in the same kind of temple architecture in Revelation 21 and 22. And what is the light of the heavenly Jerusalem? God is the light. And in one sense, who is the bread? Christ. So it seems to me that this is clearly portraying in this covenant relationship that what God provides for the imperative, for the ongoing life of living in fellowship and communion with God, who is present among his people through the provision, the indicatives of the priests and the sacrifice, is you will be able to fellowship with God. That is the end of the covenant. The means are being provided. This has met its completion in Jesus Christ, who is both priest and sacrifice. And guess what else he is? And temple. Christian, you have in the new covenant, in Jesus Christ, all of the provisions for you to not be separated from God's presence, but to continue forever in the rest of fellowship and communion, all in Jesus Christ. So I think there's lots of details that I am not covering, and I'm trying to go more with the theology of Leviticus. Everything that we need for God to be present among us, he has provided for us in Jesus Christ. And he will provide it forever and in perfection in the world which is to come when Jesus returns. If you've believed the gospel, this is what you've believed the gospel for. And to hearken the connection back to practical things like the petition in prayer at the beginning of our time today. A number, and we could just use Caroline Hilliker. When you have just a death that is so sad and heartbreaking, and things that would, in one sense, seem to be threats, how is it that I am going to receive what God indeed promises in the covenant of redemption, that his presence I will enter and will commune and fellowship with him now and forever. It seems these obstacles, like Nadab and Abihu's sin and defilement of the tabernacle, Israel's failure to actually keep that which is clean and to only use that which is sanctified. It seems as if those are obstacles that would indeed keep us from the end of the covenant promises. But in Christ, they have been accomplished. And nothing can prevent us from what God has offered to us in Jesus Christ. We need to see all that Jesus is and trust everything Jesus is for us in the new covenant. These things God has provided for us finally and completely in Jesus Christ. And we have to wait for him to bring them to their full application. That's how I think Leviticus informs us of what we do have in Jesus. Leviticus is not, in one sense, different than the gospel promises, but rather they find their completion in Jesus as priest, sacrifice, and temple, bringing his people into God's presence to have fellowship and communion forever. There's a lot more we could say, lots of implications, but I think that's more of kernel to kernel connections with the message or theology of Leviticus and the connection with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Questions? Great. So we skipped over all the different things that may make or may not make you clean or unclean in God's eyes. Eric.
They haven't invited, you say that since they made that fatal mistake, that it kept them from the kingdom.
I don't know if we have the ability to make those statements. And in one sense, I think whatever you say is really a theological inference from the relationship of those in the Mosaic covenant in relationship to the whatever title you give to the redemptive plan of God. So it's possible that they are not saved and enter into the final kingdom of God. But I would also say it's also equally possible that they could be, and therefore they enter into the kingdom of God. But I don't think there's something that we are able to determine from the passage. What we are able to say is they clearly sinned. They did something God commanded them. They did something that God did not command them to do, and it was evil. And so they clearly died doing sin. That in and of itself is not sufficient to say it's therefore impossible for them to enter the kingdom of God. But I can't say definitively. Here's Hayden.
Would it be accurate, like, to say, because when we were going through Nadab and Abihu, and that wrongful sacrifice, it reminded me of Cain when we were first talking about it.
Yeah.
And his wrongful sacrifice.
Good.
Is there a similarity with that? I mean, obviously the consequences were pretty different.
Yeah, there's a similarity in that you're able to see two things in continuity. Does God receive all sacrifices? No. There are things that disqualify worship. So that would be a continuity. What disqualified Cain's worship? I think we have information that enables us to say certain things because of progressive revelation. And then what we're able to say about Nadab and Abihu's, what they were doing in this strange fire. I don't think we have the same amount of information to say that they're exactly the same, apart from saying they presented something to God in an offering in worship that God did not receive. So, and we rightly extrapolate from that. God does not receive simply what people choose to give to him. he receives only that which is acceptable to him. But those are kind of two different places that you see that. So you're right to make connections, but maybe we can't say in exactly one-to-one relationship they're the same problem. They were the same, and they gave to God something that was unacceptable for him to receive. All right, I have a question. I didn't even touch it. This is normally the question when you read the book of Leviticus, right? Are you clean or unclean on the basis of your keeping or not keeping the Levitical legislation?
You can't say that because you could become unclean by something that's out of your control.
Okay.
Are you asking us, like Chris and Jesse?
Yeah. Like your kids read Leviticus, Bible reading challenge. They read Leviticus and they go, Daddy, I'm sorry, I am unclean. I cannot go to church this Sunday because, and they say whatever they ate or touched that would have made them unclean according to the legislation of God in Leviticus. Do you say, what do you say to your son or daughter?
We have a high priest.
We're not held to that.
The new covenant.
Okay, so
It's not the legislation, it's
Our
our sin that makes us unclean. It's not sacrifices of animals or incense or fire. It's like Christ did.
So, but are they defiled by violating the Levitical legislation? Leviticus. All right, so here's my answer. This is definitely, there's various ways that the church has worked through this, and I'm going to operate what I think is an easier way to put things together. Are we in this covenant relationship, which we could simply say, do we worship God by going to the tabernacle and offering priests through a Levitical priest in this covenant provision? No. We are in the new covenant. Jesus is our priest. Jesus's offering of his body, in that sense, was the offering that was given as the temple sacrifice in the very presence of God. So there's not a one-to-one covenant relationship with what is described here in Leviticus and with us, that is Christians, Jew or Gentile, who come to God in the new covenant through Jesus Christ. So it is not a one-to-one relationship of Leviticus law code and Christian defilement. So that gives a different understanding in the way in which we read and learn from Leviticus. However, does our sin, our violations of God's law, not only in heart, but also with deeds of the body, does that defile us such that we would need to see afresh what we need Jesus to provide for us? Yes, right? So in that sense, there are stipulations within the Levitical law code that do not apply to Christians, such that they think, I am not able to come to church and worship him because I touched a dead body on the way home as a paramedic. But we would also be able to see that the demands of God, which are manifest in his commands, they indeed find forgiveness in the person and work of Jesus Christ, but they are articulated not in the old covenant relationship, but in the new covenant relationship with Jesus, which is not exactly a one-to-one relationship with the Mosaic covenant. So that would be my answer.
So does any Leviticus pertain to what you're saying?
that?
Okay, what's that, Kevin?
Acts 10, Peter and Cornelius.
Yes, it does. It does address that. There's some nuances that different people would say, often related to what part of the law are you dividing, and they would say that's ceremonial. And so they would see Leviticus as primarily not dealing with moral law, but dealing with ceremonial law. But yes, that would be one place. There's a lot of very practical aspects to Leviticus that does deal with certain things. So you may have individual questions about certain aspects you may want to talk to Tim or me or Peter or Chris about, but that's my understanding of how we think through our defilement and Levitical legislation. We're going to be done with Leviticus. As much as I would not want to move, there's more that's available to us in 17 through 27. So, but with somewhat of a sensitivity to progression through the Old Testament, we're going to move on to Numbers. Thank you. Y'all are dismissed.